Welcome to this meeting of the U.S. Renew News team. I wanted, for openers, go to a new editorial that I'm working on. We generally have these discussions when we do editorials and opinion pieces. So I'm working on a new editorial that deals with the theme of democracy under attack, which has been quite prominent in the news lately if you've been following it. There have been several kind of really mainstream articles, including one by this fellow Robert Kagan, who's a well-known historian, in the Washington Post, who all say that as a result of Trump and the big lie and the stuff that's going on by the Republicans to block legislation, our democracy is seriously threatened, and I would tend to agree with that. So I'm trying to construct a U.S. Renew News editorial that pushes back on that or tries to identify some things that have to happen within our system in order to push back on this. And my list so far, I'd like to hear people's thoughts, include, first of all, what I'm calling January 6th justice, meaning that we need to find a way to hold the people accountable, not only those who just stormed the Capitol, but the ringleaders of the January 6th event, which I think the House Commission is doing right now. Second part of this strategy is passing some kind of voting rights legislation that will supersede or try to deflect what's going on at the state level in many of the Republican-controlled states. Third is to have the Democrats pass some meaningful legislation and not get involved in a circular firing squad, as I think the term is, between the progressives and the liberals. It would really be tragic if, as a result of that, none of Joe Biden's legislative agenda, the two infrastructure bills primarily, get passed. And then the fourth point in this editorial is a movement to try to reverse Citizens United and take the dark money out of politics, which I think, ever since that Citizens United decision, has been a major factor in motivating a lot of the right-wing politicians to get on board with Trump's agenda. So those are the 4 points so far in this list. Any comments, thoughts? Am I right on? Are there other things we should add in our counterattack to try to reverse the threat to our democratic system? Anyone?
Yeah, I think it sounds good. Those are a lot of good points. Especially the January 6th, what happened and how they're just letting it slide and a lot of the Republicans passing their anti-voting.
Yeah. Rod, do you think that there's any hope for this new compromise voting rights legislation to get passed?
Honestly, it's up in the air.
Yeah.
I don't know. The only thing about voting rights the last few days has been gerrymandering. So, everyone knows, every 10 years, the states are redraw congressional districts and state representative districts. And so Oregon became the first state to put their new map. It was signed into law by their governor, but one of the Republican leaders in the Oregon legislature is planning on challenging it in the courts. But there is also the Colorado state maps. And so they use an independent redistricting commission. So the legislature appoints a number of commissioners. I think it's split, like Republicans get an even amount, Democrats get an even amount, and then I believe there are 3 or 4 choices who are supposed to be unaffiliated. And Colorado approved the map, but the interesting thing is that it does not have to be approved by the legislature, and the governor has no veto over it. So once they approve it, that's it. There's no challenge to it. So that's an interesting thing. I believe California has a similar thing. So I'm thinking about a brief about that.
That would be very interesting. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, instead of leaving it to, the people in charge to redraw their own districts, why not have a commission redraw the state map and have it veto proof and not requiring any approval at all by the legislature? So That's an interesting story coming out of Colorado today.
Is it a requirement for every state to do this every 10 years?
Yep, it's in the Constitution. It's done because of population changes. So they just want it to be as accurate as possible. So every 10 years, the federal government will say, this is how many people reside in your state. So this is how many seats you will get in Congress. And so the state legislature takes that information and then redraws the maps. But for 200 years, they've totally manipulated it by drawing these bizarre looking shapes to ensure certain parties or certain candidates remain in office. But that might be changing now since people are starting to understand what that is and they don't want the same people in office. At least try to make it competitive where the Republican won't always win or the Democrat won't always win.
Yeah, very interesting. That would really make an interesting brief, I think.
So that's one thing when you're talking about anti-democratic attack. This might be one thing to mention that, there is a movement to take the power of drawing the maps out of the legislature's hands. They're the ones who are going to benefit anyway. So.
Okay, thank you. Let's hear from you all. Ryan, do you want to start and share, your last brief and what you're working on now?
The last one was first one, honestly, I've been just completely slammed over at the firm lately. I've got one about half done on the audits and how they're really just being used to, fertilize the echo chambers. They aren't really doing a whole lot, but despite the fact that they haven't provided any results regarding voter fraud, there's still voter restrictive laws being passed, like over in Texas, which was on John Oliver's show pretty recently. They actually had a clip of a white legislator talking with a black legislator that was calling it, a new poll tax, voter disenfranchisement. White guy called them colored.
So there are 4 states now that are doing audits. Is that right?
Let me see. I know that Arizona just finished one. I forget where else they're being.
Texas is doing one, but just targeted at a couple of districts.
Sounds about right.
And then Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. So, I think when you do this brief, it would be helpful to our readers to briefly bring people up to speed with where each of those states are at. I know that Arizona completed theirs with the conclusion that Biden won, right?
Yep.
And Texas is doing one, but only targeted, my understanding is, to certain districts that Biden won, not statewide. I know less about what's going on in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, but maybe you could research that and include that in your brief.
Take a look at the further ones. I've been mostly focusing on the Arizona audit.
Okay, great. Ibrahim, do you want to talk about, I haven't read it yet, your brief on our deal with Australia?
Sure. So my last brief was on this new security pact between the US, the UK, and Australia. It was a deal that was announced on September 15th. The deal is to have technology sharing, more military hardware sharing between those 3 countries. And it most, frustratingly to China and to France, it's going to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines from the U.S. And the U.S. hasn't done that. I think in the last 50 years, this is the first time they're sharing nuclear submarine technology. They had only done it with the U.K. It's obviously angering a lot of people. A lot of people are worried. They're afraid. China's saying that the U.S. is engaged in new Cold War tactics. The U.S. is saying that it's just to protect security. France is upset because it lost a bunch of money and it's out on a deal with Australia. And it caused France to recall its ambassador from the U.S. for the first time ever. France is the U.S.'s oldest ally. It would help the U.S. in the war for independence against the U.K., against the British. And over the sub deal, it just decided this made us more upset than anything else. And so it recalled its...
I think they patched it up a little bit now, right?
Yeah, the Biden administration reached out to them and they had a discussion with Paris, and France actually signed a new deal with Greece to provide them with some warships. So they're kind of like, we didn't need it anyways. But that deal is seen as a growing push for the Biden administration and the U.S. Now that it's done in Afghanistan on the ground, it's starting to shift more like Obama did to the Asia Pacific. And Biden held a meeting recently with India, Japan, and Australia. It's called the Quad, 4 people and 4 countries. And that meeting was really just, I mean, they're not a military alliance. They kind of just get together to talk about things going on in the region and mostly to talk, like try to see how they're going to deal with China.
Yeah. So you think the submarine deal was part of Biden's China strategy?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, it would be interesting, I think, to do a brief on Biden's overall China strategy in general. I mean, if we can piece together, it seems there's a submarine deal. There's some effort to, I think, reconstitute the Obama Trade Pact.
The TPP?
TPP, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's some effort afront to deal with China over its technology stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you're interested, it would make a good brief. Okay, so Ron, can you share the work that you did a really good brief on the Texas abortion law?
I went through that and, I was reading the stories online, and a lot of people believe it may have been an attack on abortion rights. But if you look at the case closely, it was, it didn't make a statement against Roe versus Wade. The Supreme Court order was almost like a procedural order. If any of you know or have been following the stories, the Texas abortion law called SB 8, it does not allow state election officials to enforce the law. So if a person, anyone like you, me, or anyone else wants to sue an abortion clinic or healthcare provider for providing an abortion, they are permitted to bring a lawsuit. And if they win, then they get money damages of $10,000. So this person doesn't have to have any connection to any person. Like I said, it could be me. You could just walk into Texas and file a lawsuit, which creates an atmosphere of almost like a vigilante approach. First one in, whoever wants to bring the lawsuit can do it. So that was what the Supreme Court was focused on. They were focused on, we don't want to make a decision about this case because it's very unique in that we're allowing ordinary people to bring the lawsuits. So they wanted to give first crack at the state and federal courts to make a decision on that before they ruled. But, when the story hit the media, it's like, the Supreme Court not intervening was almost that people viewed it as a message that they didn't want to block the suit because they supported Roe versus Wade. So I wrote my brief about the unique facts of that case and why this approach is unwise. I mean, if you allow ordinary people to bring lawsuits for anything, it's not going to end up just to be on abortion rights. With political atmosphere, you can see states saying that, anyone can bring a lawsuit against maybe a free speech case, maybe against a protester, or maybe against LGBTQ rights. Right. So that hasn't happened yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if some state legislatures are looking into that. Maybe they can say, let's allow ordinary people to start suing gay people or protesters. So that vigilante approach was something the Supreme Court could have at least temporarily stopped. But I think when they didn't, they just made the situation worse by saying that this is an accepted procedure. So that was my brief. Check it out, read it if you want. And I think that case is not over. It's definitely going to be in the news. It looks like it might be headed for the Supreme Court. So I think that's something to follow, just to see how that goes. Not just for the abortion rights, but for the vigilante approach that Texas put together.
I have a question about that. Maybe Ryan, who's also a lawyer, could help answer this. Doesn't the legal profession have standards for dealing with certain crimes or certain misdemeanors whereby in order to have a legal case, you need like an organized plaintiff and defendant?
You're talking about standing. You need to have somebody that is actually injured by the law.
Yeah, but...
Or you need to have somebody who is injured even though they can't stay injured by the time that the case comes by the nature of it. For example, pregnancy. You cannot finish a court case before birth. And so a case that is capable of being repeated, even if it isn't right at the time when it is being litigated.
Okay, but my question is not so much when the case can be litigated as the format for the litigation. In other words, this idea of vigilante justice, where anybody can kind of zoom in and bring a suit to me just intuitively, but I'm not a lawyer.
Well, they created a cause of action for the average person. As long as that cause of action basically defines an injury by having to suffer an abortion near you, I think that that would be, I mean, technically it is a cause of action.
Yeah.
I think that you can sue on that, saying that nobody was technically harmed, so they shouldn't have standing. And I mean, hey, this is an analysis on the spot. So if I say something wrong, try not to quote me on it. But yeah, they created a cause of action. They're not technically enforcing it at the governmental level. So they're trying to argue that there isn't governmental action, I believe, is the workaround. Yeah, I mean, what was said earlier is absolutely right. They can, if this is allowed to fly, create private causes of action for other public behavior, such as Second Amendment. I don't like that my neighbor has a gun. They're going to create a cause of action where I can sue somebody for having a gun, and they're not technically making guns illegal, so it's not running afoul of the Second Amendment exactly, but it does wind up discouraging gun ownership.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And also, when you say about discouraging gun ownership, neighboring states like Oklahoma and Louisiana are now seeing more Texas women coming into their states for an abortion. So you can see how the law is now discouraging, people in the state. I mean, they can still cross state lines and get an abortion, but actually in the state, women are being, discouraged from even considering any kind of medical procedure in the state. So, which goes against Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade, doesn't distinguish by state lines. It says a woman is guaranteed a right to an abortion, and, that shouldn't matter where she lives.
Yeah, it's a disturbing law, really.
The one thing about the law that I've also read, people are talking about, could this also be, when you're talking about standards for lawyers, could this be a frivolous lawsuit? That's one thing that I've seen. I don't know the legal merits of that, but if you're inviting regular people to bring lawsuits just for the money, you can probably argue that might be a frivolous lawsuit. And so far, I believe there are 2 lawsuits that have been initiated, and they're from people who are coming from out of state. They're not even Texas. They're religious people from Indiana or Missouri. So you're inviting all these crazies to come in, and it's going to get out of hand.
One of them's even better. It's done by a disgraced former attorney under house arrest that just wants the money, which, I mean, it's fascinating to watch a man at that point in his career admit that he has nothing to lose and just put all of it into one swing. Yeah. But that's basically what he's done.
Right. And if you can see how it's affecting abortion, then you can see how crazy it can get when, for things like protesters or any other issue that you can bring up. It's just going to incite very strong emotions. And, if we see disgraced, disbarred lawyers now, there's a lot of them out there, and they might be ready to come out for something else. So.
Yes, they are fascinating creatures.
Wow. Well, I can't believe that the Supreme Court allowed that to happen, but they did.
That's one thing about that. I just want to say one more thing.
Yeah.
The Chief Justice Roberts, who's, known as a conservative, he actually sided with the dissenting opinion. And he said we should have temporarily suspended this law until the court case was finished. So he kind of knew where it was going. He could have stuck to his right-leaning beliefs and sided with the majority, but he didn't. He actually said, no, this is going to cause problems. So it's best to maybe suspend it until the case is finished. So, a lot of people don't like Chief Justice Roberts, but he was very perceptive about this case.
And what's the status of the case? Is it close to being resolved one way or another?
The case is still continuing. It was brought by the ACLU on behalf of abortion providers. When it went to the Supreme Court, they were merely asking for a temporary injunction. Let's temporarily suspend the law until we finish the case. So the Supreme Court said no, so the case will continue while the law is in effect.
Okay, thanks, Rod. Anything else you want to report on?
Not much at this moment. Things are just getting started up here again in D.C.
Yeah.
Following the stories about, the debt ceiling and everything else going on. So I think they're expecting another government shutdown. So we'll see what happens there.
No, I thought they passed the spending bill. The continuing resolution.
They did it this morning. I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, I think last night, actually. Or maybe, I don't know. I think they're they were close to doing that. Okay, thank you everybody for your participation, and I'll be in touch with everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. See you later.